Welcome to the Upstate Interview Series. I'm Luke Perry. Today I'm with Corinne Tagliarina, Director of the Human Rights Advocacy Program at Utica College and author of Bringing Human Rights Back, published in 2020 by Lexington Books. Welcome, Corinne.
Morning, Luke.
So the first question I'd like to ask has to do with sharing a little bit about the concept of human rights and what it means and why it's important.
So human rights is, at least the way we conceptualize it in our book, is primarily a way of preserving human dignity. It starts with the idea that all people have equal moral worth. There is no human that is better or more important than any other human. And so we use a definition of it's a claim that someone is making on someone, usually the state, but not always, for something that is necessary for human dignity. So it's something that is being claimed in order to provide this sort of necessary human dignity.
Thank you very much. And it seems from a scholarly perspective, it has a couple different dimensions. One is empirical, so I'm curious how a human rights perspective can enrich our understandings of political behavior. And then another dimension is advocacy in terms of trying to further human rights and human decency around the world. Can you help us understand those two dimensions a little bit?
Yeah. So empirically, a lot of times we're looking at both what are existing human rights standards, and a lot of times we're looking at that in terms of international law, treaties that have been signed and ratified by various states. We're looking at often constitutional protections of rights. Lots of constitutions have a Bill of Rights, much like the United States does, that protects a list of rights. And then we're also looking at how well those rights protections are being enforced. So what are the existing rights protections? And then are they actually being followed? And so when we're looking empirically, a lot of times that's what we're looking at. We're looking at either direct violations or we're looking at gaps between what the law says should be protected and what is actually being protected. From an advocacy perspective, human rights laws do not fully protect everything that is necessary for human dignity. Laws are a product of social compromise. They're a result of power. The lawmaking process, both internationally and domestically, it's a long process that has many, many inputs. It is not simply, hey, let's all come up with exactly the list of things that we need to protect human dignity. So advocacy is often pushing for better policies, better laws, better protections that are going to offer a more complete protection for human dignity. And then similarly, often advocacy is pushing to eliminate that gap between, well, this is what the law says is already supposed to be protected, and this is where we are. So do better. Yeah, so I think those are the two big perspectives on that.
Certainly an interesting and an important field for sure. Can you share a little bit about what particularly excites you about human rights, having that be a focus of your teaching, your research?
I love studying human rights. It is really is a hard thing to study sometimes, but I love the fact that you can see differences being made. You can see people's lives getting better. Not always, and probably not even usually, but instead of a sort of more detached, like political game approach to politics, it is very much focused on the actual humanity and needs of the people. And ultimately, government is or should be an expression of the will of the people.
Thank you. And when we think about human rights, Americans may tend to think of international concerns. China, for instance, is a prominent one that's been in the news lately, but your research highlights human rights concerns here in the United States. I wonder if you could share a prominent example with us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the three examples that we use in the book are looking at failures of policy to protect people from harassment online, particularly women and other marginalized groups. We have a right to security, the right to feel safe. In general, that's seen as a pretty normal um, purpose of policing. Like if you have someone calling you on the phone and saying, "I'm going to murder you," that's generally something that the police you would say, "Oh, call the police. They should address that." With the internet, we're seeing a lot of issues with trying to enforce things like that, or unwillingness to enforce it, or inability to enforce it. So we look at that. That's obviously a worldwide problem that is not limited to the United States. We also look at children's rights, specifically looking at, we have a number of policies in the US that are already meant to try to equalize opportunity for children. Because even when you have a strong ethos of personal responsibility, the way that really dominates in US politics, you can't hold an infant personally responsible for their own well-being. Like that doesn't work. Infants can't be responsible for their own well-being. So we have seen social programs in the US try to actually deal with that in protecting children. And we talk about the ways in which those often fall short, frequently because they are either have very limited budgets, so not everyone is actually getting access to them that needs access to them, or they have very, very strict eligibility requirements, which doesn't necessarily reach everyone who needs it. And then finally, we talk about the right to clean water, which is currently not a right that is recognized legally in the United States. It is recognized generally internationally. It's recognized in constitutions of other states, but the United States doesn't recognize this as a right. But we saw over the past decade with Flint, the way in which the protections that do exist for public water systems broke down and provided unsafe water, with the government ignoring it for a period of time and dismissing the concerns of the citizens when they complained. And further investigations after Flint has shown that like lead is a major problem in a lot of municipal water systems. That is not like they might not be facing as high levels as Flint was facing, but like safe drinking water is a major, major issue in a lot of places in the United States. And so we talk about what protecting that as a right would actually do versus treating that as more of a political issue that you can go back and forth on. Whether or not the water you drink is going to make you sick, from a human rights perspective, is not up for debate. That's not something that you can compromise on.
Fascinating. And certainly lead's unfortunately been a problem in upstate New York, Utica, Syracuse, both in terms of water systems, in terms of paint. So our region is not immune to these issues for sure. I'd like to pick up on one of the topics you mentioned in regards to social programs and the well-being of children. As you know, COVID relief has been a primary focus in terms of federal legislation over the last year. And more recently, we've seen various proposals by US senators on both sides of the aisle in regards to child poverty. And so I wondered if you thought this is a unique moment for perhaps increased willingness to focus more on this issue in ways that maybe we haven't seen before. And as you mentioned, maybe spend and invest in this issue like we haven't seen before.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the really interesting things about the policies that were passed sort of immediately after COVID became an issue were that they, like, the payments went to everyone. And that's actually a major idea behind a major policy suggestion that we make in trying to provide a human rights framework, is that don't worry about trying to figure out, well, who needs it the most and how are we going to distribute it? And oh no, what if this group of people gets it and we don't want them to get it? Just give it to everyone. Like, yeah, it might end up costing a little bit more than it would have otherwise, but honestly, the cost of enforcing eligibility adds a really high administrative cost anyway. Just send it to everyone. When everyone gets the same thing, people are much more likely to support policies like that, because nobody's getting something better, nobody's getting something worse. And while human rights isn't necessarily about treating everyone completely equally, when we're talking about social programs that are providing entitlements, a lot of times, yeah, it means making sure that everyone is getting access to these entitlements, not just certain groups. So that was actually really encouraging. And then it's been a little bit discouraging that this most recent round of COVID relief has been really stuck into like, well, what if we don't want everyone to get the same amount of the checks? It's like, we're back to, no, we can't possibly give the same entitlements to everyone. The other thing that COVID has really highlighted and has really brought into the fore of US politics is this idea of a universal basic income. Universal basic income is actually one of the really essential economic rights, because it means that you aren't dependent on your employer or your family for your very basic needs. That even if you can't work, even if you have a terrible job and you need to be able to quit, even if you get fired, even if your family doesn't want to support you, even if you are disabled, even if you get sick, that you are able to afford and pay for your basic needs: shelter, food, water, medical care. There are countries that have something approaching a universal basic income. There have been a few experiments with it in cities over the past couple decades. That has never really been an issue that got much traction within US politics. The idea that you would just pay everybody a certain amount of money just because they're living in the US. That is really kind of an anathema to a lot of US political thought. So the fact that that has brought this issue into actual political discussion, this is something that we're making our policymakers actually talk about, has been really encouraging, because that means like we might actually move forward. I don't know that we're ever going to end up with an excellent, totally sufficient universal basic income, but moving closer would help so many people.
I think that's going to be one of the most interesting policy issues in Western civilization through the rest of the century. As you said, other countries have moved in that direction, and the US tends to be on the tail end of shifts in social policy, as you know. So I think this is the beginning of a long conversation. Now, in the short term, how about universal payments for things like being a parent to try to address child poverty? Do you think at this point these are more just proposals like we've seen for Mitt Romney and others, or do you think that idea might have some traction here in the coming years rather than decades? I know it's hard to say, and I'm sorry to
Yeah,
put you on the spot, but I'm curious
no,
what you might think.
that's fine. Actually, something like payments for being a parent, that would actually be something that you would normally see a greater ability to see bipartisanship about. Like, that's the sort of social compromise that you saw in a lot of European countries, both from the leftist parties and the more right, like Christian Democratic parties, where there was this idea that like, oh yes, that's something we can agree on. We want to support people being able to be parents and to make sure that their kids get everything that they need. That hasn't necessarily been an issue that has gotten bipartisan support in the US, however. Um, Honestly, a lot in part because of racism. There's a lot of stigmatization of certain groups of people, primarily Black women, having children. And this idea that we should only encourage certain groups of people to have children. Um, so I don't know if we're going to see that, especially with the sort of hyper partisan environment we have now. But potentially that is an area where you can see a lot of area for compromise, because most parties, even if it's even though it's for different reasons, um, want to support the ability of families to have children and to make sure that they're getting a good start in life.
It's very interesting. Yes, from a campaign perspective, it's hard to be against kids, and obviously keeping the population growing steadily is in the national interest as well. And the wrinkle with Romney is, obviously coming from Utah, they have the highest birth rate in the country, largely because of their Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints influence. And so these federal payments would be welcome, even though Utahns tend to be more conservative than liberal. And then, unlike any other religious group or state, the LDS tradition, the Latter-day Saints, they have their own social network system as well, which is a private system. So it's really interesting, the idiosyncratic forces that may be at play with that proposal as well. But when you talk about bipartisan, and this is what I like to close with, and some of the other things that you call for in your book, like you mentioned, more universal application in the pursuit of human rights and certain benefits. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tensions between moving in that direction, perhaps, and political culture in America, like individualism, or even contemporary hyper-partisanship, where even a year ago we had bipartisan relief for a number of COVID bills, and now we have a new government and a new administration, and at least at this point, the rhetoric seems to be changing. So how do you sort of think about these tensions in terms of what you propose, and then the cultural or immediate political realities in America in terms of policy?
Yeah, so one of the major stumbling blocks in the United States, at least, is very much this idea of personal responsibility and this very individualistic ethos, and the idea that law is meant to punish. Typically, when we think about you're sending someone's going to court, someone's being brought to court, it's because that specific person has committed a wrong, and the way that that gets put right is by punishing them, by putting them in jail. Human rights and a human rights framework doesn't necessarily support that approach to law. Even when we talk about like civil law, like, oh, if something bad happens to you, oh, you should sue that person to get your money back, to get retribution for that. With a lot of human rights problems, there is not always a very clear person to blame. Sometimes there is. And when there is, when the rights violations have happened as a result of a specific person or group of people actively violating laws, absolutely, they should be held accountable. But that doesn't actually fix anything for the people whose rights have been violated. So that's one thing that we really talk about in terms of the right to water, because the US actually, with the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, has some fairly strong criminal penalties for violations of those laws. And actually, talking about that in terms of like other environmental laws around the world, like the criminal penalties are pretty stringent. And we're seeing it go through the criminal process right now. We've seen indictments. We're seeing this happen. And none of that actually makes the water drinkable for people in Flint, which is where the rights violation is. And so honestly, one of the biggest stumbling blocks is sort of uh, radically changing the idea of who and how laws are supposed to protect. Are laws meant to help and make people's lives better and fix things, or are laws meant to punish people who violate them? Because those are
Excellent.
actually different things.
Certainly. The book is Bringing Human Rights Back, published by Lexington Books, now available. Thank you, Dr. Corinne Tagliarina.
Thank you so much, Luke.
And thank you for watching the Upstate Interview Series. For more, check out ucpublicaffairs.com.